I have held the same philosophy and now hold for as far back as I can remember. I have learned a great deal through the years and extended my knowledge of details, of specific issues, of definitions, of applications, and I intend to continue expanding it, but I have never had to change any of my fundamentals. My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. For decades now, the intellectuals have been progressively preaching and advocating the idea that the intellect is impotent, that man can know nothing for certain, that reason is unreliable, and in effect man has no power to know the facts of reality. This amounts to men who, proclaiming themselves intellectual, spend their time denying the validity of the intellect. That is a form of committing suicide. And today, when you see the rise of such openly mystical, anti-intellectual philosophies as Zen Buddhism or existentialism, doctrines which cannot really properly be called philosophies, this is the admission of intellectual bankruptcy on the part of those who accept it, if in a group of men. Therefore, the first thing that a man who wants to be an intellectual would have to accept is a full understanding of the fact that man must be guided by reason, and that it is only on the basis of reason that he can approach other men and discuss, cooperate, or act with them, or deal with them. On the basis of emotion, he would have to resort to blind force, because emotions are irrational or unprovable. If two men act on the basis of their emotions, they have no means of communication. When emotions are put in their proper place, which means as the consequence of reason, not as the leader of reason, then men have a common vocabulary, they have a common means of understanding, and a common frame of reference and arbiter, which is reality.
If people observe their own unconscious tendencies in other people, this is called a projection. Political agitation in all countries is full of such projections, just as much as the backyard gossip of little groups and individuals. Projections of all kinds obscure our view of our fellow men, spoiling its objectivity, and thus spoiling all possibility of genuine human relationships. And there is an additional disadvantage in projecting our shadow. If we identify our own shadow with, say, the communists or the capitalists, a part of our own personality remains on the opposing side. The result is that we shall constantly, though involuntarily, do things behind our own backs that support this other side, and thus we shall unwittingly help our enemy. If, on the contrary, we realize the projection and can discuss matters without fear or hostility, dealing with the other person sensibly, then there is a chance of mutual understanding, or at least of a truce. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves. The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Sometimes, though not often, an individual feels impelled to live out the worst side of his nature and to repress his better side. In such cases, the shadow appears as a positive figure in his dreams. But to a person who lives out his natural emotions and feelings, the shadow may appear as a cold and negative intellectual. It then personifies poisonous judgments and negative thoughts that have been held back. So whatever form it takes, the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody just those qualities that one dislikes most in other people. It would be relatively easy if one could integrate the shadow into the conscious personality just by attempting to be honest and to use one's insight. But unfortunately, such an attempt does not always work.
are a fluke. You are a separate event. And you run from the maternity ward to the crematorium, and that's it, baby. That's it. Now, why does anybody think that way? There's no reason to, because it isn't even scientific. It's just a myth. This whole idea that the universe is just nothing at all but unintelligent force playing around and not even enjoying it is a put-down theory of the world, and making out that because they put the world down, they were a superior kind of people. So that just won't do. We've had it. Because if you seriously go along with this idea of the world, you're what is technically called alienated. You feel hostile to the world. You feel that the world is a trap. And you, poor thing, have to put up with being in a body that's falling apart and that gets cancer, that gets the Great Siberian Itch, and it's just terrible. And these mechanics, doctors are trying to help you out, but they really can't succeed in the end. And you're just going to fall apart, and it's a grim business, and it's too bad. So if you think that that's the way things are, you may as well commit suicide right now. Unless you say, well, I daren't, because there really, after all, there might be eternal damnation. Or then I identify with my children or something, and I think of them going on and without me and nobody to support them. Because if I do go on in this frame of mind and continue to support them, I shall merely teach them to be like I am. And they'll go on dragging it out to support their children, and they won't enjoy it. And they'll be afraid to commit suicide, and so will their children. They all learn the same lesson.
The aim of human life is to know thyself. Think for yourself. Question authority. Think with your friends. Create new realities. Philosophy is a team sport. Philosophy is the ultimate aphrodisiac pleasure. Learning how to operate your brain. Learning how to operate your mind. Learning how to redesign chaos. The religious leaders and the political leaders want to give you orders to run your life, to determine how you think. The basic goal is to operate your own mind. Operate for yourself.
The boundary dissolution is alarming to the ego. It doesn't like that feeling, and it tells you that you're dying. And psychedelic voyagers have to learn to just, when that red switch goes on, you just reach out and turn it off and say, oh no, it's set wrong, you're not dying. But it tells you that you're dying because the ego very strongly identifies with the equilibrium of the physical body. And as the physical body begins to slide into the intoxication, the ego is saying, what's happening here? Wait a minute, I'm losing coherency. This is not good. You made a mistake, Joe. We need help, Joe. It's coming upon. You say, chill. It's going to be all right. And so you have to discipline yourself that way. The dissolving of the ego, that is the dissolving of this maladaptive behavior pattern that has made our sexual and social politics so complicated. In other words, the ego is not a good thing. It is a its existence in each one of us in so expressed a form is a symptom of neurosis, a cultural neurosis. And the psychedelic dissolves the ego, but the ego protests noisily while this is going on. And then people who are very ego dependent, if they have a psychedelic experience, they usually only have one, and then they say, well, that was like going nuts. I hated it. I just hated it. It was awful, because they are very strongly identified with the ego. Another person who isn't so strongly identified with the ego could look at the identical experience and say it was a wonderful liberation. It was just the quintessence of freedom and light and openness. So when I say we are pathological and that we need to take strong medicine to fix ourselves, I don't mean the kind of medicine where you can't feel it working. I mean the kind of medicine where you can feel it working.
The pursuit of happiness means a man's right to set his own goals, to choose his values, and to achieve them. Happiness means that state of consciousness which comes from the achievement of your values. Now, what can be more important than happiness? But happiness does not mean simply momentary pleasures or any kind of mindless self-indulgence. Happiness means a profound, guiltless, rational feeling of self-esteem and of pride in one's own achievement. It means the enjoyment of life, which is possible only to a rational man on a rational code of morality. What that code is, I couldn't possibly tell you in a brief interview, but those who are interested will find it in my books, particularly in Atlas Shrugged. To put it in my terms, I would say it is important to be moral. Well, I would stress the positive, not the negative.
They live a lot along here, and they're not working class people. They are people who dropped out of college because they thought it was stupid. And they're that sort of people. We would call them perhaps beatniks. But you see, the city doesn't like it because they aren't owning the right sort of cars, and therefore the local car salesman isn't doing business through them. They don't have lawns, and so nobody can sell them lawnmowers. And also they wear blue jeans and things like that, and so the local dress shops feel a bit put out having these people around. And they live very simply. Well, you mustn't do that. You've got to live in a complicated way. You've got to have the kind of car, that identifies you as a person of substance and status and all that. So there's a great problem here in our society. Now, why is there this problem? There's always a very inconsiderable minority of these non-joiners or people who check out of the game. But you will find that insecure societies are the most intolerant of those who are non-joiners. They are so unsure of the validity of their game rules that they say everyone must play. Now that's a double bind. You can't say to a person, you must play, because what you're saying is, you are required to do something which will be acceptable only if you do it voluntarily. You see? So everyone must play is the rule in the United States. Now that's terrifying. See, it's all right when you know what's right. There is an aristocracy, there is the clergy, and they know what should be done, and they're used to ruling, see. But now it's in your hands. You say, well, what are we going to do? Well, I think this way, and you think that way, and he thinks the other way. And so we're all unsettled. And therefore, we become more and more conformist. Individualism, rugged individualism, always leads to conformism, because people get scared. And so they herd together, and compounded with industrial society, mass production, etc. They all wear the same clothes, and they're sensible clothes that don't show the dirt too much, and we get duller and drabber and with the exception of the Californian Revolution.